Karen screamed from across the street. "I told you to follow the rules, Michael." Her voice sliced through the quiet cul-de-sac like a warning siren. Seconds later, my entire house went pitch black. No flicker, no gradual dim, just a sudden suffocating darkness that swallowed every corner of my living room. And in that instant, with my laptop dead and the air turning eerily silent, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. Karen didn't yell things she didn't mean. I had been working late, trying to finish a deadline I'd already stretched thin, when the lights blinked once, twice, and died. My computer shut off mid-sentence, the hum of the AC dropped into nothing, and for a moment I sat frozen, staring at the reflection of my confused face in the darkened screen. A faint, acrid smell drifted from the hallway, sharp and metallic, the kind of scent I associated with burnt wiring. My chest tightened. This wasn't normal. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and followed the smell toward the breaker panel near the back door. The metal casing was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been. Something had overloaded it. Or someone wanted it to look that way. My pulse picked up as I stepped outside into the night air, which felt heavier than usual, as though the neighborhood itself was watching. The grass crunched softly under my shoes as I moved toward the side of the house where the main line connected. My beam landed on something that made my stomach twist. A bright, clean cut right through the thick insulated cable. Not frayed. Not chewed. Sliced. The ends were smooth like they'd been cut with a tool meant for precision, not chance. That's when I saw her. Karen Whitfield stood on her porch, hands folded behind her back like she was inspecting a military formation. The glow from her patio light carved sharp angles across her face, highlighting that signature smirk she wore whenever she felt powerful. She wasn't surprised to see me out there. She wasn't concerned. She was waiting for my reaction. Her eyes didn't widen at the darkness swallowing my home. She didn't ask if something had happened or if I needed help. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, almost curiously, as though evaluating whether her message had landed. And just like that, the realization hit me. Not only was this intentional, but it was targeted. Personal. Deliberate. She had been itching for a reason to put pressure on me ever since I moved in, and tonight she'd taken her first real swing. I forced myself to take photos of everything, the cut line, the scorch marks near the breaker, even the angle of the wire lying on the ground. My hand shook between shots, not from fear of the dark, but from the cold certainty that this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to start something small. She liked escalation. She liked control. And now she believed she had mine. As I knelt to get a close-up of the insulation tiers, my flashlight swept across the grass, and that's when I saw them. Fresh footprints. Deep impressions in the damp soil, leading directly from my yard, straight toward Karen's driveway. She stormed toward me yelling, "You're about to learn how this neighborhood really works." Her voice ricocheted across the quiet street, sharp enough to raise the hairs on my arms. Her flashlight beam hit my face like an interrogation light, forcing me to squint as she closed the distance between us. Something was off, way off. Her urgency wasn't the normal HOA bravado. This was personal, almost triumphant, as though she'd been waiting for this exact moment. I stayed rooted beside the severed power line, the smell of burnt insulation still coating the air. Karen didn't glance at the cable on the ground. She didn't need to. She already knew it was there. Instead, she jabbed her flashlight toward my porch like she was pointing out a crime scene. "This," she snapped, "is exactly what happens when homeowners think they can install unauthorized lighting without board approval." I blinked. "Lighting changes?" "Karen, I didn't install anything. My power just—" She took a step closer, cutting me off. The beam from her flashlight hit my chest, then slowly dragged up to my face, as if she was scanning me for lies. "Don't play dumb, Michael. I warned you about altering exterior fixtures. Your refusal to comply puts the entire neighborhood at risk." The irony of her words nearly made me laugh. My house was the only one sitting in complete darkness, and she was scolding me like I was the one sabotaging things. But her tone wasn't just accusatory. There was a venom to it I hadn't heard before, something sharper, more deliberate. This wasn't about a rule. This was about control. And tonight she wanted to make sure I knew exactly who ran this subdivision. Trying to steady my voice, I said, if I violated something, then show me the documents, the official bylaws, the written regulations. I want everything in writing. The moment I mentioned documents, her expression faltered for half a second. Not fear, annoyance. A tiny irritation that flickered in her eyes before she hid it behind a tight smile. You'll get them when we process your violation notice, she said. Until then, I suggest you stop making changes to your property. Karen, I said, pointing my flashlight at the cut cable. Someone sliced through my power line. This isn't a violation. This is vandalism. She angled her head, following the beam of my flashlight just long enough to acknowledge the evidence. Then with a smirk curling at the edge of her mouth, she said, looks like poor maintenance to me. You should take better care of your utilities. That smirk, that casual dismissal, it wasn't the reaction of someone shocked or confused. It was the reaction of someone who knew exactly what happened and fully expected me to be powerless to do anything about it. That was the moment I felt it, the spark of suspicion shifting into certainty. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random. She planned this. Or at the very least, she was involved in a way she didn't want to admit. As she turned back toward her house, flashlight bobbing, I heard the faint creak of another porch door opening. Another board member, Alan, stepped out, folding his arms as he watched her approach. Karen leaned toward him, whispering with a tone far too satisfied for someone discussing a blackout. I wasn't meant to hear it, but I did. Phase 1 is done. The electrician stepped back and shouted, Michael, this wasn't damage, this was sabotage. His voice echoed against the quiet houses, louder than he probably intended, but the shock in his tone made it impossible for him to hold back. My stomach dropped instantly. Hearing it from him, someone trained, someone who knew exactly what he was looking at, turned my unease into something heavier. Someone wanted my house powerless, and they wanted it badly enough to risk burning the place down. He crouched again, running his fingers along the exposed end of the wire. Look at this, he said, holding the beam of his work light steady. This isn't weathered. It's not animal damage. These are clean tool cut marks. Straight. Precise. Done with a heavy-duty cutter. He tapped the insulation with a gloved finger. You don't get edges like this unless someone knew what they were doing. The words hit harder than the blackout itself. Clean cuts meant intention. Intention meant planning. Planning meant somebody had taken time, my safety, into their own hands. The electrician shook his head and stood, brushing off his jeans. Whoever did this wasn't just messing with you. They were trying to send a message. And honestly, you're lucky the line didn't arc. This could have caused a fire inside your walls. Could have taken out half the panel. I exhaled slowly, trying not to imagine flames licking up my siding while I slept. So, this couldn't have been an accident? He didn't even hesitate. Not a chance. You need to report this. Immediately. I already knew who I needed to report it to, and it wasn't the HOA, not that they would have lifted a finger anyway. But I went through the process, more out of obligation than hope. I contacted the HOA office first thing that morning, and the response was exactly what I expected. A flat, dismissive email stating they could not verify any community involvement, and that homeowner utilities were not the responsibility of the association. That wasn't the worst part. Attached to the same email was an official violation notice, filed earlier that morning, claiming I had unapproved lighting fixtures and had modified exterior components without authorization. Modified, as if I'd personally taken a chainsaw to my own power line. It was almost laughable if it wasn't so predictable. Karen had fired her shot the second she thought I was vulnerable. The blackout wasn't enough. She needed paperwork to push the narrative. Now, she had both. I walked the electrician through the previous night, explaining how the power went out right after Karen's shouting match with me. He listened quietly, nodding in places, his expression tightening at others. When I mentioned her smirk, her denial, her refusal to acknowledge the cable damage, his jaw flexed. "That's bold," he muttered. "Most people at least try to pretend they don't know what happened." I spent the next hour taking every photo I could. Multiple angles of the cut line, the burn marks, the sag in the wiring. I documented timestamps of when the blackout occurred, the moment I stepped outside, even the email the HOA sent me. I saved everything in a separate folder, a precaution I never imagined I'd need when I bought a home. As the electrician finished packing up his tools, he paused beside me, his voice lowered, almost cautious. "Michael, someone wanted you scared," he said quietly. Then, after a beat, "Or gone." I opened my door to Karen yelling at neighbors. "He's a threat to this community." Her voice ripped through the quiet morning like a siren, each word dripping with accusation. Before I could even step outside, I saw them. 3 bright orange HOA citations slapped onto my door in a crooked line, the tape still fresh. Nothing about this felt random. This was coordinated, timed, and meant to humiliate me before I'd even had a chance to shake off sleep. I pulled the citations down, scanning each one with growing disbelief. One claimed I'd left dangerous debris in my yard. Another accused me of disrupting neighborhood harmony with excessive nighttime noise. The third, my personal favorite, suggested I'd modified my home exterior without approval. All outright lies. If anything, I'd barely touched my property since the blackout because I was too busy trying to figure out who cut my power line. As I stepped outside, Karen was pacing near my yard with her ever-present clipboard and a bright yellow measuring tape dangling from her wrist. She stretched the tape across my lawn as if she were surveying a crime scene. Every few seconds she'd mutter something under her breath, scribble on her clipboard, then glance at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I forced myself to stay calm. "Karen, what exactly are you accusing me of now?" She didn't even look at me. "You should know," she said in a sing-song voice, the kind people use when they're enjoying the taste of their own authority. "Boundary violations, inconsistent yard height, improper exterior alignment." She flicked her wrist, retracting the tape with a click. Standard issues for homeowners who don't understand the rules. I glanced around at the neighbors. Some stood behind their curtains, others behind cracked doors. A few lingered on their lawns pretending to sweep or water plants, but their eyes were fixed on Karen, watching her escalate, yet no one said a word. The board members, who usually hovered near her, weren't offering clarification, defense, or even conversation. Their silence was suspicious, almost rehearsed. They kept their distance like they didn't want to be associated with whatever performance she was putting on. But the strangest part? They wouldn't meet my eyes. Not a single one. It was as if they knew something was coming and didn't want to be on the receiving end of my questions. Karen strutted closer, lowering her clipboard as though announcing a victory. "Given the severity of your violations," she said, "the board has authorized an emergency inspection of your property." "What violations?" I demanded. "Name one legitimate thing I've done wrong." She flipped to a different page on her clipboard. "You'll see them listed during the inspection. It's scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9, and you're required to be present." My jaw clenched. An emergency inspection? For what? Having my power line sabotaged? For being in her way? It made no sense unless the goal wasn't compliance but control. I tried to reason with her. "Karen, my home has been without power. My line was cut. I already had a professional out here. Shouldn't you be concerned about safety?" She raised a brow, feigning innocence. "If something dangerous happened, Michael, you should have maintained your property better. Power issues don't just appear." The implication was clear. She was rewriting the narrative before I could even finish gathering evidence. She wanted the community to see me as negligent, unstable, a problem to be managed rather than a neighbor to be supported. And the board, every one of them, was letting her. I watched as two board members, Alan and Denise, walked past us without slowing, their gazes glued to the sidewalk. They didn't say hello, didn't acknowledge me, didn't acknowledge Karen, just hurried away like they wanted to pretend they weren't part of this. That avoidance told me more than any citation ever could. They weren't just ignoring the truth, they were afraid of it. Afraid of being connected to her actions. Afraid of being implicated. As I stood there gripping the stack of bogus citations, Karen snapped her clipboard shut and leaned in just enough for me to hear her. "Tomorrow's inspection will settle everything," she whispered. I didn't like the confidence in her voice. It was the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. And when I finally looked up the name of the inspector she'd assigned, my stomach twisted. He had a notorious reputation for siding with her every single time. Tom rushed to my porch and whispered, "Michael, she did the same thing to me. Worse." His tone wasn't dramatic. It was fear. Tight, controlled, the kind that only comes from someone who's lived through something similar and knows exactly how it ends if you don't fight back. I hadn't even closed the door behind me before he stepped inside, looking over his shoulder like Karen might appear out of the shadows. Tom Grayson wasn't the type to rattle easily. Retired Marine, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who carried discipline in his posture and caution in his eyes. But tonight, he looked unsettled, the lines around his jaw tight, his voice low. "She went after me the same way," he said. "It started with false violations. Then she started showing up outside my place at night, claiming she was checking for code compliance. And then one morning, my irrigation system was ripped apart. Clean cuts. Like someone knew exactly what they were doing." My pulse tightened. "And you think she did it?" Tom said, cutting me off. "No question, but I couldn't prove it back then. She knew exactly how to hide her footprints." He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "I didn't say anything before because I didn't want to drag you into this. But the second I saw your power line cut, I knew it was starting again." Before I could respond, there was a light knock on my open door. I turned to see Mrs. Halpern, one of the quietest, most soft-spoken neighbors on the street, standing on my porch with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I heard what happened," she said. "Karen did something similar to my son's house. She called in fake violations until he finally moved out. She pushed him so hard he couldn't take it anymore." Her voice broke on the last sentence and she looked down, ashamed, though she had no reason to be. One by one, more neighbors began to appear. Not crowding my yard, not forming some heroic stand, just offering small pieces of a story that was starting to sound disturbingly familiar. A ripped-out garden hose here, a sabotaged gate lock there, mysterious finds, suddenly failing appliances, harassment disguised as community enforcement. I realized then that resentment had been building quietly for years. Nobody wanted to speak up because Karen controlled the HOA board like it was her personal army. She had allies, influence, and the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. But now, for the first time, the silence was cracking. I grabbed my notebook and began writing everything down. Dates, names, incidents, anything that could establish a pattern. Tom helped me piece together timelines, comparing which households had been targeted and when. The more we connected the dots, the clearer the picture became. Karen didn't enforce rules. She hunted. She pushed homeowners into submission, using the HOA as a weapon and fear as a tool. "She always starts the same way," Tom said, tapping a finger on the table. "A bogus violation, then property harassment, then a major incident that looks accidental but isn't. Once you're overwhelmed, she corners you at meetings and pressures you into compliance." "And if you don't comply?" I asked. Tom's jaw tightened. "She makes sure you regret it." A cold ripple crawled down my spine. This wasn't petty neighborhood drama. This was patterned, targeted manipulation. Tom leaned in, his voice low but firm. "Michael, do you want to stop her? Permanently and legally?" I froze when I heard loud electrical humming from her backyard. It wasn't the soft buzz of a normal outdoor fixture. It was deeper, angrier, the kind of vibration you'd expect from something overloaded and ready to fail. The hairs on my arms stood up instantly. Her illegal wiring was worse than anyone suspected. And now I was close enough to hear it struggling like a live creature behind her fence. Tom walked beside me, keeping low as we moved along the property line. It wasn't trespassing, we were on my side, but the sound was unmistakably coming from her yard. We exchanged a quick glance. This was the kind of noise a licensed electrician would panic at. For Karen to just let it sit back here, hidden, humming like a bomb waiting for a spark. It said everything about how little she cared about actual rules when they applied to her. I angled my flashlight through a gap in the wooden slats. The beam landed on a tangled mass of wiring snaking out from beneath her shed. Thick black cables, some new, some frayed, all feeding into a jumbled metal box that looked like it had been mounted by someone with more courage than training. The cables weren't buried properly. They weren't shielded. They weren't even safely tied off. They were sprawled across the dirt like veins from a malfunctioning heart. "Are you seeing this?" I whispered. Tom let out a low, frustrated breath. "This is way beyond a violation. This is a hazard, and she's been hiding it." He wasn't exaggerating. As I shifted my angle and zoomed with my phone camera, I spotted scorch marks near the base of her shed. Faint but real. Something had overheated back here before. Something had sparked, and she'd patched it up with the same arrogance she used on her HOA clipboard. "This is the person accusing you of unauthorized lighting," Tom muttered, shaking his head. I straightened, pulling up the county code database on my phone. Every property modification in our community was listed in public records. Dates, permits, approvals, signatures. It took less than a minute to find her address. And just as Tom predicted, her file was practically empty. No electrical permits, no structural permits, not a single approval for any modification she'd ever made. Karen had been hiding her own violations for years while hunting everyone else for theirs. She wasn't enforcing rules, she was fabricating authority to cover her own tracks. "This could get the entire neighborhood in trouble," Tom said. "If that wiring goes, it won't just take out her house." I felt the weight of his words settle in my chest. She wasn't just a bully, she was reckless, dangerous, and the board had let her run wild. "We need proof," I said. "We need evidence," Tom agreed. I took slow, steady photos of everything: the exposed wiring, the scorch marks, the unsecured box, the cables leading under the shed. I recorded videos capturing the loud hum, the flickers of light from the cracks in the wood, even the timestamp on my screen. If Karen wanted to push me into a corner, then she was about to find out that evidence spoke louder than intimidation. Just as I tucked my phone away, a glint caught my eye. I lowered myself again, peering through a different gap in the fence. That's when I saw it. A hidden junction box patched together with strips of gray duct tape. The tape was peeling, edges curled like dried leaves, barely holding the unstable wiring in place. Dangerously unstable. I overheard Karen shouting on her porch, "I'll make sure the inspector buries him." Her voice cut through the evening like a blade, sharp and furious, carrying across the stillness of the neighborhood. She didn't know I was close enough to hear her, but I froze in place, every part of me locking onto her words. That was her final mistake. No more pretending, no more doubt. She wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was planning to take me down for good. Earlier that afternoon, the inspector's date had been officially confirmed, tomorrow morning at 9. The very same inspector Karen always summoned whenever she wanted a predetermined outcome. Everyone knew he never questioned her claims, never challenged her authority. If she wanted a homeowner crushed under technicalities, he'd find a way to justify it. And now she was preparing him like a weapon pointed directly at me. But Karen didn't realize the ground under her was already shifting. After discovering the illegal wiring behind her fence, Tom and I had spent hours gathering organized evidence. Photos, videos, timestamps, code violations, even a cross-check of county permit records. I put everything together in a digital folder with backups on 2 separate drives and printed hard copies in case she tried to manipulate anything electronically. I was done playing her game blind. This time, I was ready. As dusk settled, Karen rushed around her backyard like a panicked animal trying to bury its own trail. I watched from my kitchen window as she dragged panels, scrap wood, and even a plastic tarp behind her shed, attempting to hide the exposed wiring. She was frantic, breathing hard, moving fast, stumbling over tools she'd left scattered in the grass. She must have felt the pressure closing in. She must have sensed something shifting outside her control. What she didn't realize was that the neighbors were watching her too. One porch light after another clicked on across the street. People stood behind their fences or leaned quietly against their door frames, pretending to check mail or water plants. They weren't mocking her. They weren't helping her. They were observing her panic like spectators who'd finally recognized the cracks in her armor. Silent resentment, once hidden, had turned into silent witness. Tom stayed close, stepping into my living room with a stack of printed documents. "Everything's lined up," he said. "Photos, timestamps, statements. I'll be there with you tomorrow." She's not steamrolling you like she did the rest of us. Just hearing it grounded me. Tom, the retired Marine who'd survived far harsher battles than HOA politics, was preparing for this like a tactical operation. He reviewed the evidence with a precision that made me realize something important. I wasn't alone anymore. The pattern we uncovered wasn't just about me. It was about everyone she'd bullied into silence. I felt a small shift inside me then. Fear was still there, but something new was layered beneath it. Resolve. Karen had spent years twisting rules to benefit herself, but now those same rules were about to turn on her. Later that night, as I double-checked the evidence folder, I caught movement through my front window. One of the board members, Alan, was standing at the HOA office door, glancing around nervously. I watched him slip inside after hours. A moment later, the faint glow of a monitor lit up the blinds. I stepped closer, narrowing my eyes. He was deleting emails, fast, frantic, selective, incriminating ones. Right before the inspection, Karen screamed, "Why are my lights flickering? What did you do?" Her voice cracked through the morning air like a whip, frantic and disbelieving. Before anyone could answer, her entire house snapped into darkness. Every bulb dying at once, every window going flat and lifeless. The sudden silence that followed felt heavier than the blackout itself. For the first time since I'd moved in, Karen Whitfield wasn't in control. I had filed my lawful report with the utility company the night before, explaining the dangerous wiring behind her shed. I sent them videos of the humming junction box, photos of exposed cables, and timestamps matching the exact noise levels we'd heard. It wasn't revenge. It was safety, plain and simple. And the utility company took one look at the evidence and labeled it an emergency risk. So at 8:47 a.m., barely 13 minutes before the HOA inspection, a white utility truck pulled up to her curb. The technicians moved quickly, accessing the meter and tracing the illegal feed running under her fence. Karen burst out of her house, shouting orders like she owned the power grid. "You can't just show up without notice. This is my property. You have no authority here." One of the technicians calmly handed her a notice. "Ma'am, someone reported a hazardous electrical setup. This requires immediate shutoff until we can verify the equipment is safe." "You're shutting off my power?" she screeched, grabbing the notice and waving it wildly. "This is retaliation. This is sabotage." Her eyes snapped to me across the street like she'd found her target. "You did this. Don't you lie. You did something." I didn't say a word. That was the beauty of truth. It didn't need defending. She had created her own chaos, and now it was unfolding right in front of the entire neighborhood. And speaking of the neighborhood, porch doors opened. Curtains shifted. People stepped outside with folded arms or steaming coffee cups, pretending they were just enjoying the morning air. But their eyes were locked on Karen, wide with curiosity, disbelief, and, if I was honest, relief. The queen of the HOA had finally stumbled, and everyone wanted to witness it. Karen stomped toward the utility crew, pacing, yelling, threatening to call lawyers, the mayor, the governor, anyone who might rescue her. But the technicians didn't budge. They sealed the box, tagged it, and stepped back. Your power will remain off, one said, until an inspection confirms the setup is safe. Her face drained of color. No power meant no control. And no control meant panic. Right then, like fate had rehearsed the moment, the inspector's silver sedan rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac. He stepped out with a clipboard tucked under his arm, looking more irritated than curious, clearly expecting another one of Karen's orchestrated victories. Instead, he saw chaos. Karen practically sprinted toward him. "You're not inspecting him today," she shouted, pointing at me like a deranged traffic officer. "He sabotaged my power. This whole inspection is compromised." The inspector raised a hand, silencing her instantly. His gaze shifted to the utility tag, the sealed meter, then the cluster of neighbors quietly watching her meltdown. Something in his posture changed. A shift from blind ally to cautious evaluator. "Karen," he said slowly, "your house is the one with the safety violation." She froze, mouth open. The inspector tucked his clipboard under his arm and gestured toward her backyard. "Karen, we need to see your backyard. Now." The inspector shouted, "Stop! Nobody touch anything!" His voice thundered across the backyard, loud enough to freeze Karen mid-stride. She stood inches from the tangled mess of wires behind her shed, her hand poised as if she could somehow hide the entire disaster by covering a single cable. But it was too late. Every neighbor watching from their fences could see it. Karen had been caught red-handed in the mess of wires and violations, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have a script prepared. The inspector stepped around her with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes tracing each exposed wire like he was examining a crime scene. "Where are your permits for this installation?" he asked. Karen blinked rapidly, her voice cracking as she replied, "Permits? This is part of a minor upgrade. It absolutely required permits," he snapped. "These are high-voltage lines feeding into an unprotected junction. And that shed," he pointed to the structure leaning slightly to one side. "How long has that been standing without proper support beams?" It's decorative," she insisted. He crouched near the ground, pointing to the trench cutting through her soil like a wound. "This trench is fresh. And your drainage system is completely compromised. Runoff from your yard could flood 2 neighboring properties if we get a heavy rain." The words hit harder than any violation she'd ever given the rest of us. Her backyard wasn't just messy, it was a hazard. An unpermitted, illegally wired, unstable hazard that she'd managed to keep hidden behind fences and intimidation. Karen tried to pivot. "This isn't what it looks like. She thrust a finger at me. "He sabotaged my yard. He planted all of this to frame me." The inspector didn't even turn around. "Ma'am, please stop talking." That command silenced her more effectively than any argument I could have made. Her face flushed a blotchy red, her lip trembling with silent fury. She looked around desperately for backup, for the board members who normally flanked her like loyal guards. But today, the board wasn't following her lead. Alan and Denise stood near the fence, their faces pale, eyes bouncing from the exposed wiring to the inspector's clipboard. Not one of them stepped forward to defend her. Not one muttered agreement or tried to shift blame. They simply watched, stunned, as the truth unraveled in front of them. The inspector walked the perimeter of her shed, snapping photos, measuring distances, and jotting down notes so quickly his pen looked like it was on fire. He photographed the duct-taped junction box, the scorched patches of dirt, the unplugged breakers dangling like limp vines. Every new detail made the board members retreat another step. Karen's desperation grew. "These are minor violations. You're exaggerating. It's just typical homeowner adjustments." "Typical," the inspector barked. "This is a labyrinth of unlicensed electrical work. And you're the HOA president? You've been writing citations for homeowners while hiding all this?" "I wasn't hiding anything," she snapped. "I was maintaining..." "Maintaining what?" he interrupted. "A fire hazard? A power theft? A structural violation? Because that's what this looks like." The neighbors' whispers spread like wildfire. People who'd been quietly afraid of Karen for years were finally seeing the truth unfold. Their unspoken resentment sharpened into something closer to validation. The tyrant had cracks after all. Karen's breaths turned shallow as she watched the inspector document everything extensively. Every click of his camera made her flinch. Every scribble in his notes chipped away at her authority. She kept glancing at me with a look that shifted between hatred and panic, like she was still trying to figure out how this had slipped beyond her control. When the inspector finally stood, he motioned me aside. Karen strained to hear, but he intentionally lowered his voice. "This," he whispered, eyes serious and steady, "may go beyond HOA, possibly criminal." During the emergency meeting, neighbors yelled, "You endangered all of us, Karen." Their voices ricocheted through the packed clubhouse, echoing off the walls with a force nobody had ever dared to use against her. Karen stood frozen at the front of the room, her clipboard trembling in her hands. For the first time, she had no defense. Her eyes darted across the crowd, searching desperately for someone to back her up, but all she found were crossed arms and angry stares. The room smelled of coffee and tension. Every seat was filled, every corner occupied. People stood shoulder to shoulder, some still in work uniforms, others in pajamas, all brought together by the same reason. They'd finally had enough. Enough of her bullying. Enough of her manufactured violations. Enough of her turning the HOA into her personal weapon. Karen lashed out first. "You're all being manipulated," she shouted, voice cracking. "He's twisting things. He staged that wiring. He fabricated everything to make me look guilty." The board shifted uncomfortably behind her. Their faces, usually hard and unreadable, were cracked open with unease. Even Alan wouldn't meet her eyes. I stood slowly, feeling my heart thump against my ribs. "If I staged everything," I said evenly, "then why does the utility company's report match my photos? Why did the inspector find unpermitted wiring in your yard? Why were your lights flickering moments before they shut your power off? And why," I added, holding up the printed report, "did you file a violation against me before my power line was even cut?" Murmurs rippled through the room. I walked to the front and set a neatly organized evidence packet on the table. Photos of her wiring, screenshots of county permit records, audio recordings from neighbors, time-stamped videos of the illegal junction box humming like a live threat, utility inspection notes, everything meticulously arranged, written, backed up, and undeniable. Tom stepped forward next. "I warned you all," he said. "She's been doing this for years. I've been quiet long enough." Mrs. Halpern raised her hand meekly, then spoke with surprising strength. "She pushed my son out of this neighborhood, not by rules, by harassment." Another neighbor stood, then another. One by one, people came forward, not with anger, but with truth. Real accounts, real stories, real harm. Karen's face went pale. "You're all lying," she snapped, pointing at the crowd. "This is a conspiracy. You're breaking HOA protocol." A soft gasp passed through the room. I turned to her. "Karen, tampering with utilities isn't an HOA issue. It's a felony." That single word, felony, hung in the air like smoke. The board members exchanged glances, fear flickering in their eyes. This was no longer about favoritism or pettiness or deciding whether someone's mailbox was an acceptable shade of beige. This was liability, criminal liability, and they knew they couldn't protect her anymore. The board president, a man who rarely spoke at meetings, finally pushed himself to his feet. His hand shook as he lifted a sheet of paper, the weight of responsibility settling over him like a burden he should have shouldered years ago. "We've heard enough," he said. "It's time to vote." Karen's jaw dropped. "You can't vote without letting me defend myself." "You did," he replied, "and we have reached a decision." She screamed, "You can't fire me." The board replied, "You're removed effective immediately." Silence swept the room so heavily it felt like the air itself stopped moving. Karen's face contorted, a mix of disbelief and fury tightening every muscle. She clutched her clipboard like a lifeline, knuckles white, lips trembling as the board president's words echoed through the clubhouse. For years she had commanded this room, barked orders in it, humiliated neighbors in it, weaponized rules in it, and now, that same room swallowed her whole. The board president cleared his throat. Effective immediately, he repeated, voice steadying. Karen Whitfield is stripped of her position as HOA president and removed from all board duties. He didn't wait for applause, though the room buzzed with held-in emotion. He simply lowered his gaze, like even he was relieved to finally say it out loud. Karen staggered back a step. No, this isn't happening. I built this association. I protected this neighborhood. Her voice cracked, desperation replacing authority. She swung her glare toward the front row. Alan, Denise, say something. You know this is wrong. But neither of them moved. Alan looked at the floor. Denise folded her hands tightly in her lap. The room had shifted. No one feared her anymore. Then came the second blow. A different board member stood up, holding another document. Because of the severity of the violations and the risk posed to the community, he announced, Karen is being issued 6 major fines: electrical violations, unauthorized construction, hazardous modifications, failure to report, abuse of authority. He paused. These are non-negotiable. Gasps rippled across the room. Karen's breath hitched. Fines, she repeated, voice barely above a whisper. You're fining me? It's the minimum response, the board member replied. Frankly, you're lucky we aren't involving law enforcement. But fate had other plans. Before Karen could argue, the HOA secretary stood and announced, the utility department has already opened an investigation. They'll be contacting you for a full inspection and formal statements. Karen swayed like someone had struck her. You called the utility department on me? She shrieked, looking from neighbor to neighbor. You did this. No, I said quietly from my seat. You did this to yourself. A long, trembling silence filled the room. For the first time, Karen didn't have a comeback. She looked around for support, but found only exhaustion. The neighbors weren't triumphant. They were relieved. They were tired. They were done. Then something unexpected happened. People began exhaling. Real, honest, heavy exhales. As if everyone had been collectively holding their breath for years under her rule. Shoulders lowered. Faces softened. A few neighbors reached over and squeezed each other's hands. The tension Karen had thrived on was dissolving. Her reign, her intimidation, her engineered fear was ending, and she felt it. She grabbed her clipboard, hugging it to her chest as though it could shield her. This neighborhood will regret this, she shouted. You'll all see what happens without me. But the threat landed flat. Nobody flinched. Nobody chased her as she stormed out, her heels slamming the floor like gavel strikes from a judge losing control of his own courtroom. The moment the clubhouse door slammed shut, someone let out a shaky laugh. Another neighbor clapped softly. Then another. The room didn't erupt. It simply breathed. It felt like the first real moment of freedom we'd had in a long time. Over the next week, the transformation became visible. People walked their dogs without glancing over their shoulders. Kids played in the cul-de-sac again. The board actually talked to residents instead of policing them. And for the first time, I felt like this neighborhood might become a home. But Karen didn't disappear quietly. 2 days before her moving truck arrived, I passed her house and saw her through the window. Frantic, sweating, shoving papers into a shredder. Page after page after page. Her living room floor was littered with bags full of torn documents. She wasn't packing. She was destroying something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't finished with us yet. A letter appeared on my porch. Karen wasn't working alone. Watch your back. Just when I thought it was over, it wasn't. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, and the paper smelled faintly of burnt wood, as if someone had held it too close to a flame before leaving it at my door. I stared at it for a long moment, the wind brushing against the edges, as if urging me to open it and keep reading. But there was nothing more. Just that one chilling message. For the first time in weeks, I felt the old tension coil back into my shoulders. I had spent so much energy fighting Karen, unraveling her lies, exposing her schemes, that I'd almost forgotten corruption rarely grows alone. People like her don't rise to power by themselves. They rely on allies, enablers, people who look the other way because they profit quietly in the background. And irony hit me then. All the warnings I'd ignored when I first moved here weren't exaggerations. HOA abuse isn't always loud. It doesn't always start with a scream or a citation. Sometimes it starts with silence. A silence powerful enough to suffocate anyone who tries to resist. I learned the hard way that if you don't document everything, if you don't protect yourself, the system will gladly pretend you never spoke up at all. Documentation saved me. Photos, videos, dates, witness accounts. They formed a shield stronger than any rule Karen tried to twist against me. If there's one thing I've taken away from this ordeal, it's this. HOAs count on homeowners staying quiet. They count on intimidation, on fear, on confusion. They count on people not knowing their rights, or being too exhausted to fight for them. But they don't know what happens when a community finally wakes up. When Karen fell, it was like the entire neighborhood exhaled for the first time. People smiled more. Kids actually rode bikes down the street without Karen appearing with a citation pad. One neighbor even hung a wind chime Karen had forced them to remove years ago. Little things, but meaningful. Symbols of a community healing from a long, invisible bruise. And slowly, that unity grew stronger. Tom visited every day to check if I needed help with repairs. Mrs. Halpern dropped off baked bread just to say thank you. Neighbors who barely spoke to one another before were suddenly sharing their own stories. Stories of being threatened, fined unfairly, targeted quietly. It made me wonder how long this had been happening behind closed doors. How many people Karen had pushed out. How many voices had been silenced because they didn't have evidence or support. That's why I'm sharing all of this now, to warn others, to teach them, and to hear their experiences too. HOA abuse isn't rare. It's just hidden behind rules, titles, and the illusion of order. If you've lived through something similar, tell your story. Share it. Someone out there needs to hear it, and maybe, just maybe, it'll give them the strength to stand up the way we finally did. Because stories like these don't end quietly. And mine definitely wasn't over. A few days after Karen moved out, the street felt almost peaceful again. The sky looked clearer. The nights felt safer. The neighborhood seemed to settle into a calm rhythm. But even then, that letter haunted me. Every time I passed the shredder bags Karen left behind, I wondered what she had been trying to destroy. What secrets she'd been hiding. What evidence she couldn't risk the board finding. And then, just when I began convincing myself that the letter might have been a prank or a misunderstanding, something happened that shattered that fragile sense of peace. At exactly midnight, when the house was quiet and the only sound was the hum of the restored power line, someone knocked softly on my door. Once. Paused. Then again, slow, deliberate, patient. I stood frozen in place. The next fight was already waiting. If you've ever dealt with an HOA drunk on power, you know exactly how dangerous people like Karen can be. This story proves what happens when one homeowner finally fights back with truth, evidence, and courage. If you want more real stories of justice, corruption, and shocking neighborhood battles, make sure you support this channel. Like the video, share it with someone who's dealt with HOA harassment, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Your engagement helps expose these abuses and helps more people stand up for themselves.